Family portrait looks peaceful in 1893 Marysville until you see what's in the mirror. When the Whitmore family poses for their first official photograph, everything seems ordinary. Elias, the carpenter, Clara, his devoted wife, baby Lydia in her white dress. But when that camera flash goes off, something impossible appears in the mirror behind them. A second infant that doesn't exist. At first, they dismiss it as a printing error. The photographer assures them these things happen. But then Clara starts hearing crying from empty rooms. Shadows move in mirrors throughout their house. And that ghostly child in the reflection, it's getting clearer, getting stronger, reaching toward their daughter with each passing night. The townsfolk whisper about omens and curses. Some avoid the family entirely because in a small town like Marysville, secrets don't stay buried forever. And this one goes back to Elias's childhood, to a twin brother who died in circumstances too shameful to speak of. A death that was covered up, forgotten, denied dignity. Now that forgotten soul wants what was stolen from him, and he's not just haunting mirrors. He's coming for Lydia. During a violent storm, she vanishes from her crib, only to be found sleeping peacefully in front of the parlor mirror, the ghost child's hand almost touching hers. As the haunting intensifies, Clara and Elias face an impossible choice: continue the family silence that has trapped this spirit for decades, or confront a truth so dark it could destroy their marriage, their standing in the community, and their very souls. But what happens when the only way to save your child is to give voice to the dead? And what price do you pay when the past finally demands its due? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. In 1893, the town of Marysville existed in that fragile space between the dying frontier and the dawn of a new century. It was a place where families still lived by candlelight, where secrets could be buried in unmarked graves, and where the past had a way of reaching through time to claim what was owed. The Whitmore family thought they were simply capturing a moment, their first official portrait together. Elias, 35 and weathered by years of carpentry work, stood proud beside his wife Clara, 28 and radiant despite the hardships of frontier life. Between them sat one-year-old Lydia, dressed in her finest white gown, a symbol of their hope for the future. The traveling photographer had assured them the session would be perfect. He positioned them carefully, adjusting the ornate mirror behind them to catch more light. "This will brighten the whole image," he promised. The camera's heavy wooden box seemed to hold its breath as they sat motionless, waiting for the flash that would preserve this moment forever. But photographs, like memories, sometimes capture more than intended. When the print was delivered 3 days later, Clara's hands trembled as she held it up to the window light. There, clear as day in the mirror's reflection, was something that shouldn't exist. A second infant, translucent but unmistakable, cradled in her arms beside Lydia. Elias dismissed it immediately. "Printing error," he said, barely glancing at the image. "These traveling photographers, they rush their work." But Clara knew better. She had felt the chill in the studio when the flash went off. She had heard the whisper of something moving in the silence afterward. And now, as she stared at the impossible image, she realized their family portrait had captured more than their likenesses. It had opened a door to a secret that had been waiting 35 years to be told. The autumn of 1893 brought more than falling leaves to Marysville. It brought Thomas Hartwell, a traveling photographer whose weathered wagon and mysterious equipment promised something the town had never seen: professional portraits that could capture a family's essence forever. Word spread quickly through the small community, and within days appointments were booked solid. Elias Whitmore stood in his carpentry shop, plain shavings curling at his feet, when his neighbor burst through the door with the news. "A real photographer, Elias, with one of those big cameras and chemical baths. Clara's been talking about getting Lydia's picture taken since she was born." That evening, Clara approached the subject carefully as she served dinner. "The Hendersons are getting their portrait done tomorrow," she said, not quite meeting Elias's eyes. "Mrs. Henderson says it's only $3 for the whole family." $3 was nearly a week's wages, but Elias had seen the longing in Clara's face whenever she looked at their daughter. Lydia was growing so fast, changing every day. Soon she would be walking, talking, becoming a little person instead of the baby they had treasured for 12 months. "Schedule it," he said quietly, and Clara's smile lit up the entire kitchen. The photographer's studio was set up in the abandoned millinery shop on Main Street. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, and the air was thick with the chemical smell of developing solutions. Thomas Hartwell moved with practiced efficiency, arranging chairs and adjusting the large mirror he used to reflect more light onto his subjects. "The mirror is essential," he explained to Clara as she settled Lydia on her lap. "Without proper lighting, the image will be too dark to see your beautiful family clearly." Elias stood behind them, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder, trying not to fidget in his best suit. The camera was an imposing thing, a large wooden box mounted on a tripod with brass fittings that gleamed in the lamplight. "Now, everyone must remain perfectly still," Hartwell instructed, disappearing beneath the black cloth behind his camera. "Even the slightest movement will blur the image." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the photographer's pocket watch and Lydia's soft breathing. Clara felt a strange chill creep across her shoulders, as if someone had opened a door to the outside air. She glanced toward the mirror behind them and for just a moment thought she saw something flicker at the edge of her vision. The flash exploded like lightning, filling the room with brilliant white light. Lydia began to cry, startled by the sudden brightness, and Clara quickly comforted her while Elias blinked away the spots dancing in his eyes. "Perfect," Hartwell announced, already moving to his chemical baths. "Your portrait will be ready in 3 days." Clara paced the kitchen for the better part of Thursday morning, glancing out the window every few minutes to watch for the photographer's delivery boy. When the knock finally came, she nearly ran to the door, Lydia balanced on her hip. The boy handed her a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Hartwell says this is his finest work yet, ma'am. Says you'll treasure it always." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the photograph. The image was clear and sharp. Elias looked distinguished and proud. She appeared serene and maternal, and Lydia was captured mid-laugh, her tiny hands reaching toward the camera. It was perfect, exactly what she had hoped for. Then she looked more closely at the mirror in the background. Her gasp echoed through the kitchen, causing Lydia to look up with concern. There, clearly visible in the mirror's reflection, was Clara, holding not one child, but 2. The second infant appeared translucent, like a shadow made of light, but its features were distinct. The same dark hair as Lydia, the same tiny nose, the same reaching hands. "Elias!" Clara called, her voice higher than usual. "Come see this." Her husband emerged from his workshop, sawdust still clinging to his shirt. He took the photograph from her shaking hands and studied it with the same methodical attention he gave to measuring lumber. "Printing error," he said after a long moment. "The chemicals probably got mixed up, or maybe another plate got exposed at the same time. These traveling photographers, they're always in a hurry." But even as he spoke, Clara could see uncertainty in his eyes. The second child in the mirror looked too real, too detailed to be a simple mistake, and something else troubled her. The expression on her own face in the reflection looked different from her actual face in the photograph, as if Mirror Clara was seeing something real Clara could not. Sunday service at the Marysville Community Church had always been as much about social connection as spiritual guidance. After Reverend Ames delivered his sermon, the congregation lingered in the churchyard, catching up on the week's news and sharing the latest developments in their small community. Clara had brought the photograph, intending to show it off to the other women. She was proud of how distinguished her family looked, how grown-up little Lydia appeared, but when she unwrapped it in the bright autumn sunlight, the murmurs that arose were not of admiration. "Is that another baby in the mirror?" whispered Mrs. Henderson, adjusting her spectacles for a better look. "Lord have mercy," breathed Mrs. Patterson, making the sign of the cross. "I've heard of spirits appearing in photographs, but never seen it with my own eyes." The circle of women grew quiet, studying the image with a mixture of fascination and unease. Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized the photograph was drawing stares from across the churchyard. "It's just a printing error," she said, echoing Elias's explanation. "The photographer said these things happen sometimes." But Mrs. Kowalski, the eldest woman in the congregation, shook her head slowly. "My grandmother used to say cameras could see things we couldn't, said they could capture souls that were trapped between worlds." The comment sent a chill through the group. and several women stepped back from the photograph. Clara quickly wrapped it back up, but she could feel the weight of their stares and whispered conversations following her as she collected Elias and Lydia and hurried toward home. That night, she lay awake listening to the house settle around them, every creak and groan seeming to carry new significance. When a soft cry echoed from somewhere in the darkness, she told herself it was just the wind. The crying came again the next night, and the night after that. Clara found herself leaving oil lamps burning throughout the house, their flickering light creating dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. She told herself it was practical, easier to check on Lydia if she didn't have to light a candle every time, but practicality didn't explain why she kept seeing movement in her peripheral vision, or why the shadows in Lydia's nursery seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. The mirror in the parlor, positioned where it caught the light from multiple lamps, began to feel like a window into some other space where rules were different and impossible things could exist. "You're exhausting yourself," Elias said one morning, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "Lydia sleeps through the night now. There's no need for you to stay awake." Clara wanted to explain about the crying, about the shadows, about the feeling that something was watching them from the depths of every reflective surface in the house. But Elias was already reaching for his coat, preparing for another day of practical problems with practical solutions. "Maybe you should see Doc Hensley," he suggested gently. "Sometimes new mothers get unsettled. He might have something to help you sleep." After he left, Clara stood in the parlor holding Lydia, studying their reflection in the mirror. For just a moment she could swear she saw the faint outline of another figure beside them. Small, infant-sized, reaching toward her daughter with translucent hands. She blinked, and there was nothing but her own worried face staring back. 3 weeks later, Lydia took her first steps. Clara had been folding laundry in the parlor when she noticed her daughter pulling herself up using the sofa for support. Instead of her usual careful crawl, Lydia let go and took 2 wobbling steps toward her mother before tumbling forward into Clara's waiting arms. The joy was immediate and overwhelming. Clara swept Lydia up, spinning her around the room while the toddler giggled with delight. When Elias returned from work, Clara could barely contain her excitement as she coaxed Lydia to demonstrate her new skill. "She's growing up," Elias said softly, kneeling down to catch Lydia as she tottered toward him. "Our little girl is becoming a little person." The moment felt like a return to normalcy, a reminder of all the good things in their life. Clara decided to celebrate by inviting their neighbors for dinner the following Sunday. She spent days preparing, cleaning the house until it gleamed and planning a menu that would showcase her best cooking. "It'll be good for us," she told Elias as they rearranged the furniture to accommodate extra guests. "We've been too focused on strange things lately. We need to remember what matters: our family, our friends, our community." Elias helped her position the dining table to catch the best light from the parlor lamps, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt genuinely happy. The house felt warm and welcoming again, filled with the promise of laughter and good company. She had almost forgotten about the photograph, wrapped and tucked away in the drawer of her writing desk, and the impossible child it had captured. The dinner party began beautifully. The Hendersons arrived precisely at 6, followed by the Pattersons and the Kowalskis, all dressed in their Sunday finests. Clara's roast beef was perfectly tender, her vegetables cooked just right, and the conversation flowed as freely as the cider Elias had brought up from the cellar. Lydia charmed everyone by toddling around the dining room, showing off her new walking skills and babbling in the mysterious language that only toddlers understand. The women cooed over her development while the men discussed the upcoming harvest and the rumors that the railroad might finally extend a line to Marysville. Clara felt herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, caught up in the normalcy of neighborly friendship and domestic comfort. She was just beginning to clear the main course when she happened to glance toward the parlor mirror, visible through the dining room doorway. The scream caught in her throat, coming out as a strangled gasp that brought all conversation to an abrupt halt. Later in the mirror's reflection, clear as day, Lydia was toddling around the dining room holding hands with another child, the same translucent infant from the photograph, now grown to match her daughter's size and development. "Clara, Mrs. Henderson asked, concern evident in her voice. What's wrong? Clara blinked hard, looked again. The mirror showed only the normal reflection of their dinner party, Lydia playing alone as she should be, but Clara's hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped the serving platter. Nothing, she managed. Just thought I saw. It's nothing. But the warmth had gone out of the evening. Elias quickly steered the conversation back to safer topics, but Clara could feel the weight of worried glances following her for the rest of the meal. The guests left earlier than usual, offering polite thanks but avoiding her eyes. That night, Clara lay in bed clutching the photograph, staring at the impossible child in the mirror until her eyes burned with exhaustion. Clara's investigation began quietly, almost by accident. She had gone to the town clerk's office to register Lydia's birth certificate, a task she had been putting off for months, when she noticed the death records filed in the same cabinet. Her curiosity was innocent at first, simply wondering about the families who had come before them in Marysville, but when she saw Whitmore listed in the death records, her heart began to race. The entry was brief. Infant Whitmore died November 1858. Parents, Margaret and James Whitmore. The cause of death was listed simply as failure to thrive. That evening, she approached Elias carefully as he worked on a cabinet in his shop. I never knew you had a brother who died, she said, trying to keep her voice casual. Elias's plane stopped mid-stroke. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. When he finally looked up, his face had gone pale. Where did you hear that? The death records at the clerk's office? There's a Whitmore infant listed from 1858 that would be about the time you were born. It's none of our business, Elias said firmly, returning to his work with unnecessary force. The past is past. But Elias, if you had a twin, I said it's none of our business. The violence of his response shocked them both. Elias had never raised his voice to her in all their years of marriage. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his workbench. Some things are better left buried, Clara. Let it be. He stormed out into the cold night, leaving Clara alone in the shop with her questions and her growing certainty that the child in the photograph was not some random spirit, but family. Elias's brother, come back to claim what had been denied him in life. The Marysville town clerk, Mr. Finch, was a meticulous man who took pride in his detailed records. When Clara returned the next morning with more specific questions, he was happy to help her search through the older documents. The Whitmores, you said? James and Margaret? He pulled out a thick ledger bound in cracked leather. Yes, here they are. Married 1857, first child born November 1858. That would be your husband, Elias. And here's the death record you mentioned, dated the same day. Elias and his brother were born on the same day. Appears so. Twins by the look of it, though the death record is unusual. Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles. Usually we record more details, illness, accident, specifics. This just says, for failure to thrive, and it's signed by the midwife, not the doctor, almost like they were in a hurry to file it. Clara's heart pounded as the implications became clear. She requested copies of both records and hurried home, her mind racing with questions. When Elias returned that evening, she was waiting in the kitchen with the documents spread across the table. You were twins, she said without preamble. Born the same day, November 15th, 1858. What happened to your brother? Elias stopped in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions. Surprise, anger, pain, and finally resignation. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. My mother made me promise never to speak of it, said it would bring shame on the family name. But he's reaching out to us, Elias, through the photograph, through the mirrors. He won't stay quiet anymore. You don't understand, Elias whispered. We were poor, poorer than poor. My father had been out of work for months, and my mother was sick from the birth. They didn't have enough food for 2 babies. The truth hit Clara like a physical blow. They chose you. They let your brother die. Elias nodded, tears streaming down his face. Mother confessed it on her deathbed, said they left him outside in the cold, told everyone he was stillborn. She carried that secret for 35 years, and she made me promise to carry it too. That night, Clara heard the crying again, but this time it wasn't coming from the empty bedroom across the hall. It was coming from right outside their door. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Elias, and followed the sound down the hallway. The crying led her to the unused bedroom, the one they had always planned to turn into a nursery for future children. The door stood slightly open, though she was certain it had been closed when she went to bed. Inside, moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating a scene that made Clara's blood freeze. The old cradle, the one that had belonged to Elias's family, stored in this room since they moved into the house, was rocking gently back and forth. Not the erratic movement of wind or settling wood, but the steady, purposeful rhythm of someone soothing a baby. Clara approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. As she drew closer, the crying grew softer, more contented, as if the unseen child was being comforted by the cradle's motion. She reached out tentatively to stop the rocking, and the moment her hand touched the wooden rail, images flooded her mind. She saw a young woman, Elias's mother, pale and exhausted, holding two identical infants. She saw the terrible decision etched in every line of the woman's face, the way she kissed one baby goodbye before wrapping him in a thin blanket. She saw the back door opening onto a cold November night. Clara jerked her hand away, and the cradle stopped moving immediately. The crying ceased, leaving only heavy silence and the weight of understanding. When she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Elias, who stood in the doorway with terror written across his face. "You saw it too," he whispered. Clara nodded, taking his trembling hand. "He's not trying to hurt us, Elias. He's trying to tell us his story." Reverend Ames was a thoughtful man who had ministered to the people of Marysville for over 20 years. He had seen birth and death, joy and sorrow, and the full spectrum of human experience that existed in a small frontier community. When Claire approached him after Sunday service, he listened to her story without judgment or skepticism. "In my experience," he said, walking with her through the churchyard among the weathered headstones, "the dead don't linger out of malice. They linger when something has been left unfinished, when justice has been denied, when truth has been buried, when dignity has been forgotten." Clara stopped beside a small marker labeled simply "Unknown Child, 1862. "You believe the photograph really shows Elias's brother?" "I believe that cameras, like mirrors, sometimes reveal more than we expect, and I believe that every soul, no matter how brief its time on earth, deserves acknowledgement." Reverend Ames turned to face her directly. "The question isn't whether you're seeing a spirit, Clara. The question is what that spirit needs from you." "Elias thinks we should leave it alone. He's terrified of what people will think if they know his family's secret. And what do you think?" Clara looked out across the cemetery, at the neat rows of headstones that mark lives remembered and honored. "I think his brother has been alone in the dark for 35 years. I think he deserves better." Reverend Ames nodded slowly. "Sometimes the living carry burdens that belong to the dead. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to give voice to those who were silenced." He handed her a small card with a Bible verse written in his careful script. "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Pray on it," he said gently. "And if you decide to act, know that you won't stand alone." For 2 weeks after her conversation with Reverend Ames, Clara threw herself into documenting the strange occurrences in their home. She kept a careful journal, noting the times when mirrors showed reflections that didn't match reality, when cradles rocked on their own, when shadows moved independently of their sources. Elias joined her reluctantly at first, but gradually became as invested in the process as she was. They worked together in the evenings, comparing notes and trying to find patterns. The activity seemed to calm the supernatural disturbances, as if the act of bearing witness, of taking the manifestation seriously, provided some measure of comfort to the restless spirit. "Look at this," Clara said one evening, pointing to a week's worth of entries. "The activity is strongest on the 15th of each month. November 15th was when you and your brother were born. And it's always connected to Lydia," Elias observed. "The ghost, my brother. He only appears when she's present. almost like he's drawn to her. They had started referring to the spirit as Thomas. Elias remembered his mother mentioning the name once, in delirium during her final illness. It felt important to give him an identity, to acknowledge him as a person rather than just a haunting. Clara reached across the table and took Elias's hand. "He's not trying to take Lydia away from us. I think he just wants to be part of the family he was denied." For the first time since this had all begun, Elias smiled. "You really think we can find peace with this? All of us? You, me, Lydia? And think we have to try? For his sake and for ours." Outside, autumn rain pattered gently against the windows, and inside their home everything felt calm and hopeful. Clara should have known it wouldn't last. The storm that struck Marysville on November 15th was the worst anyone could remember. Wind howled through the town like a living thing, tearing shingles from roofs and toppling trees that had stood for decades. Rain lashed against the windows of the Whitmore house with such force that Clara feared the glass might shatter. Elias had moved Lydia's crib into their bedroom, afraid that flying debris might break the nursery windows. The family huddled together, listening to the fury of the storm and praying it would pass quickly. Clara dozed fitfully, waking periodically to check on her daughter. It was during one of these half-conscious moments that she realized something was wrong. The crib beside their bed was empty. "Elias!" Clara shook her husband awake, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Lydia's gone." They searched frantically, calling her name and checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. The house felt different in the storm, larger, darker, full of corners where shadows could hide. Clara's heart pounded with terror as images raced through her mind of Lydia wandering outside in the wind and rain, lost and frightened. "The parlor," Elias said suddenly. "I haven't checked the parlor." They rushed downstairs with their oil lamp held high, its flickering light casting wild shadows on the walls. And there, in front of the large mirror, they found Lydia. She was sound asleep on the floor, curled up on her side as if she were still in her crib. Her breathing was peaceful, her small face relaxed and content. But as their lamplight hit the mirror, Clara saw something that made her legs go weak. Reflected in the glass, lying beside Lydia in the exact same position, was another child. Thomas, no longer translucent, but appearing as solid and real as their daughter. His tiny hand was almost touching hers, and both children looked utterly at peace. "Dear God," Elias whispered, sinking to his knees beside Lydia. "He's getting stronger, more real." As if responding to his voice, both children in the reflection stirred. Lydia opened her eyes and smiled up at her parents, but in the mirror, Thomas opened his eyes too, eyes that looked exactly like Elias's, exactly like Lydia's, and reached toward them with desperate longing. The next morning, Elias sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands while Clara prepared breakfast with mechanical precision. Neither of them had slept after finding Lydia in the parlor, and the weight of their shared secret pressed down on them like a physical burden. "We can't ignore this anymore," Clara said, setting a plate of eggs before him. "Thomas isn't just haunting us. He's becoming part of our world. What happens when he becomes strong enough to take physical form?" Elias looked up with haunted eyes. "My mother used to tell me stories when I was small. Stories about the other baby, the one who went to live with the angels. I thought they were just stories, ways to help me understand that I had been special, chosen. But now I realize she was trying to tell me the truth in the only way she could." "What did she say?" "That he was waiting for me. That someday, when it was time, he would come back and we would be together again." Elias's voice broke. "I think she always knew this day would come." Clara sat beside him, taking his trembling hands in hers. "Then we need to decide what we're going to do about it. We can keep hiding from the truth, pretending this isn't happening, watching our daughter get drawn deeper into something we don't understand. Or we can face it. Face it how? By giving Thomas what he's been denied for 35 years, recognition, acknowledgement, a proper burial, even if we don't have his body, a chance to rest in peace instead of wandering between worlds." Elias was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the storm damage littering their yard. Finally, he nodded. "If we do this, everyone in town will know. They'll know what my family did, what kind of people we come from. They'll know that you're brave enough to right an old wrong, that you're strong enough to bear the truth instead of hiding from it." That afternoon, they walked together to Reverend Ames's house and told him everything. Word spread through Marysville like wildfire, as news always did in small towns. By Sunday, everyone knew that the Whitmores were planning some kind of funeral service for a child who had died 35 years ago, a child whose existence had been hidden all this time. The reactions were mixed. Some people, particularly the older women who remembered the harsh realities of frontier life, nodded with understanding. They had seen families make impossible choices, had witnessed the shame and secrecy that surrounded infant mortality in those desperate years. Others whispered behind their hands, speculating about what kind of people would abandon a baby to die. The gossip was cruel and cutting, filled with moral superiority from those who had never faced such desperate circumstances. Clara felt the weight of every stare when she walked through town, every conversation that stopped when she approached. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson turned her back rather than acknowledge Clara's greeting. At church, the Hendersons moved to a different pew, avoiding eye contact. "Maybe this was a mistake," Elias said one evening, after a particularly difficult day. He had lost 2 carpentry jobs when clients decided they didn't want work done by someone from that kind of family. But Clara's resolve only strengthened with each snub, each whispered comment. "Thomas has been alone for 35 years because people were more concerned about appearances than truth. We're not going to abandon him now because some people can't handle reality." That night, as if responding to her words, the mirror in the nursery showed Thomas more clearly than ever before. He appeared to be the same age as Lydia now, a phantom twin, reaching toward his living counterpart with desperate love. Clara no longer found the sight frightening. Instead, it filled her with fierce protectiveness for both children, the living and the dead. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Clara was putting Lydia to bed. She had just settled her daughter in the crib when every mirror in the house began to vibrate simultaneously. The sound started as a low humming, barely audible, but gradually increased until the glass was rattling in its frames like windows in a hurricane. Clara grabbed Lydia and ran to the kitchen, where Elias was cleaning up after dinner. The rattling followed them, spreading to every reflective surface, the window glass, the polished surface of the water pitcher, even the silver spoons in the drawer. "It's getting worse," Elias shouted over the noise. "Whatever's holding him back, it's not working anymore." As if in response to his words, the mirrors throughout the house began to crack, not breaking completely, but developing spiderweb patterns that spread across their surfaces like frozen lightning. And in each cracked mirror, Thomas's reflection became more vivid, more desperate, reaching toward them with increasing urgency. The climax came when the large parlor mirror, the same one that had been used in their portrait session, shattered completely. Glass rained down on the floor in 1,000 glittering pieces, but impossibly, each shard continued to show Thomas's reflection. Dozens of fragment mirrors, each one containing a piece of the lost child's image, scattered across the room. Clara knelt among the broken glass, Lydia clutched in her arms, and looked into the largest shard. Thomas's face stared back at her, his mouth moving as if he were trying to speak, his tiny hands pressed against the inside of the glass as if it were a window he couldn't break through. "We have to do something," she whispered. "We have to set him free." Elias nodded, his face pale but determined. "The funeral, we'll hold it this Sunday whether the whole town comes or no one does. Thomas deserves his dignity and we deserve our peace." Clara and Elias spent the week preparing for a funeral unlike any Marysville had ever seen. With no body to bury, they focused on the symbolic elements that would give Thomas the recognition he had been denied. Elias worked late into each night, crafting a small wooden coffin from the finest oak in his workshop. It was barely 2 feet long, sized for the infant Thomas had been when he died, and Elias carved it with the same care he would have given to his own child's final resting place. Clara sewed a tiny burial shroud from white linen, embroidering it with wild flowers and the name, Thomas Whitmore, in delicate script. She had never known her brother-in-law, had never held him or heard his cry, but somehow the act of creating these final gifts felt like a form of mothering, a way of giving him the care he should have received in life. Reverend Ames helped them choose readings and plan a service that would acknowledge both the tragedy of Thomas's death and the hope of his peaceful rest. "Every soul deserves witness," he told them. "Every life, no matter how brief, has meaning." The hardest part was writing the notice for the church bulletin. How do you announce a funeral for someone who officially never existed? In the end, they settled on simple words. The Whitmore family invites the community to join them in a memorial service for Thomas Whitmore, infant son of James and Margaret Whitmore, who died November 15, 1858. All are welcome to pay their respects and pray for his eternal rest. When Sunday morning arrived, Clara dressed Lydia in her finest white dress and gathered the courage to face whatever judgment awaited them at the church. Saturday night, Clara sat beside Lydia's crib with one of the mirror shards in her lap. Thomas's reflection had grown so clear over the past week that she could see individual eyelashes, could watch his chest rise and fall as if he were breathing. Sometimes she caught herself talking to him, telling him about Lydia's latest developments, sharing the kind of everyday details that aunts and uncles typically heard about their family's children. "Tomorrow you'll finally have your day," she whispered to the reflection. "Finally have people acknowledge that you existed, that you mattered." In the mirror fragment, Thomas seemed to be listening. His tiny face turned toward her voice, and for just a moment, Clara could swear she heard something. Not quite a voice, but a sound like wind through leaves or water over stones. A sound of acknowledgement, of gratitude. Elias sat in his chair by the window, staring out at the churchyard where they would hold the service tomorrow. He had been quiet all week, wrestling with the weight of family secrets finally brought to light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to have dreams when I was small. Dreams about playing with another boy who looked exactly like me. We would run through fields together, build forts, share secrets. I always woke up feeling like I had lost something precious, but I never knew what." Clara reached over and took his hand. "Maybe those weren't dreams. Maybe they were memories of what should have been. I hope he can forgive us. Forgive me for living when he couldn't. You didn't choose this, Elias. You were an infant. The only choice you have now is how you honor his memory." Outside, a candle flickered in the church window. Reverend Ames preparing for tomorrow's service, keeping vigil for a child who had waited 35 years to be mourned. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant autumn light that made every color more vivid. Clara had expected few people to attend, perhaps Reverend Ames themselves and maybe one or two of the more sympathetic church members. She was stunned when they arrived at the church to find nearly half the congregation already gathered. Some faces showed curiosity, others discomfort, but many reflected something Clara hadn't expected: compassion. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly woman who had spoken about spirits and photographs, nodded respectfully as they passed. Mr. Finch, the town clerk who had helped Clara with the records, tipped his hat. Even some of the families who had been avoiding them stood quietly at the back of the crowd. Reverend Ames had prepared a simple wooden platform near the church steps. The tiny coffin rested there, draped with wild flowers that the more sympathetic townspeople had quietly contributed. Clara carried the mirror shard carefully, planning to place it beside the coffin as a way of including Thomas in his own memorial service. As the service began, Elias stood to address the gathered crowd. Clara had wondered if he would be able to find the words, if the shame and guilt would silence him at the crucial moment. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "My parents, James and Margaret Whitmore, were good people, facing impossible circumstances. They were starving, sick, and desperate. When their twin sons were born in the winter of 1858, they made a choice that haunted them for the rest of their lives." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Elias continued steadily. "They chose to save one child when they couldn't save both. They chose me, and for 35 years my brother Thomas has been waiting for someone to acknowledge his existence, to give him the dignity every human soul deserves." As Elias spoke, Clara watched the mirror shard in her hands. Thomas's reflection had never been clearer. She could see every detail of his tiny face, could watch his expressions change as if he were following his brother's words, but something else was happening. The desperate reaching, the frantic energy that had characterized his appearances was gradually fading into something else. Peace. I don't ask you to judge my parents for their choice, Elias continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I ask you to understand that love sometimes wears the face of impossible decisions. They loved us both, me, the son they kept, and Thomas, the son they lost. But love without acknowledgement is incomplete. Reverend Ames stepped forward to begin the prayers, and the crowd grew still. As the familiar words of the funeral service filled the air, Clara felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. The oppressive weight that had hung over their family for weeks began to lift, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. She looked down at the mirror shard and gasped softly. Thomas was still there, but he was no longer reaching desperately toward the living world. Instead, he appeared to be settling back, his tiny hands folded peacefully over his chest, his face serene and content. As the final prayer ended, Lydia, who had been unusually quiet throughout the service, suddenly clapped her hands and laughed, looking directly at the mirror fragment. But when Clara followed her daughter's gaze, she saw only Lydia's own reflection, clear and normal, with no trace of the phantom twin who had haunted them for so long. The crowd began to disperse, some people approaching to offer quiet words of support, others simply nodding respectfully before departing. Clara realized that something fundamental had changed, not just for Thomas, but for their entire family's place in the community. In the days following the memorial service, the Whitmore house settled into a peace they hadn't known since the photograph was first taken. The mirrors no longer showed impossible reflections. The cradle in the unused bedroom sat still and silent, and the shadows fell where they should according to the natural laws of light and substance. Lydia slept soundly through each night, no longer stirring restlessly as if listening for sounds only she could hear. Clara found herself sleeping deeply too, no longer startled awake by phantom crying or the feeling of unseen presence. Even Elias seemed lighter, as if confessing the family's secret had lifted a burden he had carried unknowingly his entire life. The townspeople's reactions were mixed, but gradually warming. The initial scandal gave way to a grudging respect for the family's courage in facing their past. Some of Elias's carpentry clients returned, and Clara found that her conversations with other women in town were no longer shadowed by whispered speculation. It was the right thing to do, Mrs. Kowalski told her after church one Sunday. My own grandmother lost 2 babies to hunger during the hard winter of 1847. Sometimes survival requires choices that break your heart. At least your Thomas finally has his peace. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara and Elias themselves. They talked more now, shared more, trusted each other with truths that might have remained buried. Their marriage had been tested by supernatural forces and family secrets, and it had emerged stronger. One evening as they sat by the fire, Lydia playing contentedly at their feet, Clara reflected on how much their lives had changed. Do you think he's really gone? She asked. Or do you think he's just quiet now? Elias considered the question carefully. I think he got what he needed. Recognition, family, love. Maybe that's all any of us really want. Spring brought subtle reminders of the presence that had shaped their winter. On windy evenings, Clara sometimes heard what might have been a child's laughter, mixed with the sound of air moving through the trees. Elias occasionally glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision while working in the shop, but when he turned to look, nothing was there except dancing dust motes and shafts of sunlight. Lydia seemed most attuned to these gentle echoes. She would sometimes pause in her play to look toward empty corners of rooms, smiling and babbling as if responding to a conversation only she could hear. But these moments held no fear, no urgency. Instead, they felt like the comfortable awareness of family nearby, the way a child might acknowledge a beloved uncle's presence without needing to see him directly. Clara began to understand that Thomas hadn't truly left them. Rather, He had found his proper place in their family structure, no longer a desperate spirit demanding recognition. He had become what he should have been all along, a cherished uncle, a protective presence, a reminder of love that transcends the boundaries between life and death. The mirror fragments had been carefully swept up and buried beside the empty coffin in the churchyard, but Clara kept one small piece, barely larger than her thumbnail, pressed between the pages of her Bible. Sometimes when she prayed, she would glimpse a flicker of movement in its surface, like light reflecting off water. It comforted her to know that Thomas was still close, still part of their story. "If I don't fear him anymore," she told Elias one evening as they watched Lydia toddle around the parlor where the large mirror used to hang, "he feels like family now, like he always should have." When the traveling photographer returned to Marysville that summer, Clara surprised herself by suggesting they sit for another portrait. Elias was hesitant at first, remembering the chaos that had followed their first session, but Clara felt it was important to document their family as it was now. Peaceful, complete, honest about their past. "No mirrors this time," she specified when they arrived at the makeshift studio. "Just us, just our family as we are." The photographer, a different man than before, younger and more talkative, arranged them carefully. Elias stood behind Clara's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder with confident affection. Clara held Lydia, now walking confidently and chattering in the mixed language of toddlers everywhere. The little girl wore the same white dress she had worn to Thomas's memorial service, and Clara had braided wildflowers into her dark hair. When the flash went off, Lydia laughed instead of crying, clapping her hands at the bright light. The photographer emerged from beneath his black cloth with a satisfied smile. "Beautiful family," he said warmly. "This'll be a portrait to treasure." 3 days later, when the finished photograph was delivered, Clara unwrapped it with hands that no longer trembled. The image was perfect. Clear, warm, filled with genuine happiness. Elias looked proud and peaceful. Clara appeared serene and confident, and Lydia was captured mid-laugh, her whole being radiating joy. There were no impossible reflections, no phantom children reaching from other worlds, just a family that had learned to embrace truth, however painful, and had found peace in acknowledgement rather than denial. That evening, Clara placed the new photograph on the mantel beside a single wildflower. Not for themselves, but for Thomas, wherever he was now, so he would know he remained part of their story. The final chapter of their story came quietly, as peaceful endings often do. Clara and Elias decided to create a memory box, a wooden chest that Elias crafted with his finest attention to detail, lined with soft fabric that Clara sewed by hand. Into this box went both photographs, the original portrait that had revealed Thomas's presence, and the new one that showed their family at peace. They also included the small mirror fragment Clara had kept, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The memorial service program, signed by all who had attended. A lock of Lydia's hair from her first haircut. The tiny white dress she had worn to Thomas's service, now outgrown but too precious to discard. "We're not hiding from the past," Clara explained as they arranged these mementos together. "We're preserving it, making sure Thomas's story doesn't get lost again." The box found its place in their bedroom, where they could access it easily but where it wouldn't dominate their daily lives. Sometimes, when Lydia was napping and the house was quiet, Clara would open it and look through the contents, remembering how far they had all come. The original photograph no longer frightened her. Instead, she saw it as evidence of love's persistence, proof that family bonds could transcend death, that truth would always find a way to surface, that acknowledging pain was the first step toward healing. As summer faded into autumn, and Lydia grew from a toddler into a little girl, the Whitmore house settled into the rhythm of normal family life. There were no more supernatural disturbances, no more midnight appearances, no more desperate reaches from beyond the grave. Thomas had found his peace, and in doing so had given his living family the gift of honest, fearless love. Love that didn't hide from difficult truths. Love that honored all members of the family, even those who existed only in memory and spirit. On November 15th, 1894, exactly 1 year after the storm that had brought their crisis to its peak, Clara lit a candle for Thomas and placed it in the window. It was a tradition she would continue every year, a quiet acknowledgement of the uncle Lydia would never meet, but would always know through stories and love.